Have you ever felt that your life was placed in a moment of decision, a moment so delicate, so important, that everything seemed to hold its breath around you? Perhaps not with trumpets or crowds, but in quiet ways, a choice of honesty when silence would be safer, a step of faith when fear whispers, "Not yet." Tonight, we rest within such a story. The story of Esther, a woman who was not born into power, yet was placed by God into a place of purpose. Her story is one of hidden strength, of courage found in stillness, and of divine timing so perfect that heaven itself seemed to pause to watch. Her life reminds us that faith is not always loud. Sometimes, it is the quiet turning of the heart toward trust, the steady decision to stand when trembling feels easier, the whisper of a prayer before walking into the unknown. As you prepare to rest tonight, take a slow, deep breath. Let your body soften. Let your heart slow its rhythm. Let the worries of the day fall away like leaves letting go of the wind. This is your time to be still, to remember that courage and peace are not opposites, but companions that walk side by side. If these nightly reflections bring you calm and help you find peace, take a gentle moment to like this video, subscribe to Whispers of Faith for more soothing biblical stories, and share where you're listening from tonight. Your presence helps keep this space warm, prayerful, and growing. Now, take another slow breath. In through the nose, and out through the heart. Let the sound of stillness fill the room. Tonight, we travel back to an ancient kingdom, to marble halls and golden courtyards, to a throne that gleamed beneath 100 lamps, and to a young woman whose courage changed the course of a nation. Her name was Esther. The story begins not with glory, but with quiet beginnings. A young orphan girl raised by her cousin Mordecai, living in the bustling city of Susa, where the Persian Empire stretched as far as eyes could dream. Life there moved in the rhythm of sandals upon stone, of merchants calling in the sun, of scrolls and law and the language of kings. No one looking upon her would have known what God was preparing. She was gentle, humble, unnoticed by the world, yet chosen in heaven long before the crown would touch her brow. Her beauty was quiet, not only in face, but in spirit, the kind that carries peace where words fail. And in that calm, God was shaping something extraordinary, a courage that would rise not from pride, but from obedience. At this time, the great King Ahasuerus ruled from India to Ethiopia, 1,000 miles of wealth and wonder. His palaces were filled with gardens that bloomed even in the heat of noon, and his feasts stretched for days, each one more splendid than the last. But even within the golden walls of power, there are moments of emptiness. A decision made in anger, a throne without peace, a crown searching for purpose. And so, when the queen fell from favor, the court whispered of a search, a gathering of maidens from every corner of the empire, each chosen for beauty, for grace, for possibility. Among them was Esther, a girl whose heart belonged not to the palace, but to God. And though she could not yet see it, divine purpose was already threading her path like light through the weave of fate. She did not seek a throne. She did not desire grandeur. Yet destiny often hides in simplicity, and courage often begins in ordinary obedience. As she was taken into the palace, the corridors stretched before her like endless rivers of marble and silence. Golden lamps flickered, casting halos across the polished floors. Every sound seemed to echo, the faint rustle of silk, the murmur of servants, the distant hum of music from the court. But within her heart, a stillness remained. For Mordecai had taught her, do not fear where God leads. He writes stories long before we can read them. She carried those words like armor, not upon her body, but within her soul. And though she did not yet understand why she had been chosen, she walked forward anyway, step by step, faith before understanding, obedience before revelation. As you listen tonight, perhaps your own path feels uncertain, a corridor stretching farther than you can see. But remember Esther, she did not wait for courage to feel ready, she walked while still trembling. She trusted that even silence can be sacred when God is the one guiding your steps. So, rest now, let that truth settle deep within you. You, too, were born for such a time as this, not by accident, but by design. You are seen, you are placed, you are being prepared for a purpose that only faith can unfold. Breathe. And let the peace of God wrap around you like the soft cloak of night. The story of Esther begins quietly, but soon it will rise with the music of destiny. The palace of Susa shimmered like a dream beneath the morning sun. Its golden roofs reflected the light like calm fire, and its courtyards breathed with the scent of myrrh, cedar, and sweet lotus. Everywhere, there was motion, servants carrying jars of oil and linen, scribes whispering over scrolls, musicians testing the quiet strings of harps before the feast. Yet amid this brilliance, one heart remained still. A young woman moved through the marble halls with soft, deliberate grace. Her steps made no echo. Her eyes held neither fear nor pride. Her name, Esther. She had been taken from her home not by ambition, but by decree, one among many maidens gathered to stand before the king. And though her outward beauty drew attention, it was the peace in her spirit that caught heaven's eye. The attendants watched her quietly. There was something different about her, a gentleness that asked for nothing, a silence that carried strength. Where others adorned themselves with jewels, she carried kindness as her crown. And in a place filled with competition, her calm became her distinction. In the chambers of preparation, months turned to seasons. Perfumes and oils filled the air, each day a ritual of refinement. But Esther's heart was not caught in the luxury. While others dreamed of silk and splendor, she whispered prayers into the quiet. She remembered the streets of her home, the laughter of children, the wisdom of Mordecai, and the God who had never left her side. Every night, before sleep, she would stand at the window, the city below glowing in amber light, and she would speak softly into the air, "Lord, if this is where you have placed me, let me serve with humility. Let me be more than seen, let me be useful." Those words became her rhythm, and heaven listened. When her time finally came to stand before the king, Esther carried no adornment beyond what had been given to her. Others arrived with necklaces heavy as armor, gowns bright as the sunrise, but she walked forward clothed in peace. The great hall shimmered with lamps, and the king sat upon his throne, his gaze distant, weary from faces that sought to impress. But when he looked upon Esther, something within him quieted. It was as if the room itself exhaled. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was not beauty that moved him, it was the presence of serenity. A rare stillness in a world that never ceased to clamor. He spoke gently, his voice breaking the hush that had gathered. "What is your name?" "Esther," she replied, her tone humble, her eyes lowered. The syllables fell like water upon stone. And from that moment, favor began to grow, not by persuasion, but by providence. Days passed. The scroll of decree was written, and Esther, the orphan, the exile, the quiet one, was crowned Queen of Persia. Trumpets sounded. Garlands of white lilies hung from the gates. The people cheered, though few knew her story, and none could imagine what part she would one day play in theirs. But heaven knew. For behind the veil of celebration, God's plan was already unfolding, a thread of deliverance woven through gold and silk, through courage yet untested. The same hands that had guided her from the modest home of Mordecai were now guiding her toward a purpose she could not yet see. In the quiet of her chamber that night, Esther sat beside the window once more. The crown rested lightly on her hair, a symbol of honor, yet also of burden. She touched it gently, and her fingers trembled. She whispered, "Lord, I am not strong. But if you are with me, I will not need to be." Beyond the walls, the kingdom slept. But above her, the stars shimmered, as though nodding in answer. It was the beginning of a sacred alignment, a moment when earth and heaven agree upon one heart. Mordecai, from afar, heard the news of her ascension. He did not boast, nor did he rest. He walked the streets of Susa each day, his prayers rising like incense. He knew the favor of men could change in an instant, but the favor of God was eternal. He prayed that Esther would remain unseen by pride, yet visible to divine purpose. And she did. Each morning she rose before the court awakened, kneeling in quiet worship, speaking softly the psalms of her people. The palace was grand, but her sanctuary was stillness. Her story was only beginning. For beyond the calm of her crown, a shadow was stirring in the heart of the kingdom. A man named Haman, powerful, proud, and bitter, was building a plan that would soon darken the entire empire. He did not yet know that the one destined to unmake his schemes was already within the palace walls. Waiting, praying, listening. And though Esther could not yet see the danger, God was already teaching her the rhythm of courage, to listen before speaking, to wait before acting, and to trust before understanding. Let your own heart rest in that truth tonight. You do not need to see the whole path to walk in faith. Sometimes the silence before the call is holy preparation. Sometimes the waiting itself is obedience. Breathe. And let that peace settle like dawn light on water. God is already at work, even in what feels hidden. In the days that followed, peace still draped the palace like fine linen. But beneath its folds, unrest began to whisper. It moved quietly at first, through glances, through murmurs, through the way courtiers paused before speaking. The air itself seemed to thicken, as if preparing to hold secrets. Among the king's nobles was a man whose pride had outgrown reason. His name was Haman, a man of high position, dressed always in authority, his smile measured, his ambition unmeasured. The king had elevated him above the other princes, placing his seal upon Haman's hand as a sign of trust. And wherever Haman walked, men bowed, a ripple of obedience spreading before his steps like wind across wheat. All bowed. Except one. Mordecai. He stood each day by the king's gate, watching, listening, praying, the same place where news and destiny met. When Haman passed, Mordecai neither knelt nor trembled, for his allegiance was already spoken for. He served the king faithfully, but he bowed only to God. At first, Haman's pride stung like a small wound. But pride rarely heals, it festers when fed by silence. And soon, his offense became hatred. He learned Mordecai's name, his people, his faith. And in that knowledge, he saw not one man, but an entire nation he despised. Anger sharpened his thoughts until they gleamed with cruelty. He whispered plans to his circle, his words smooth as oil, his heart hard as iron. Before long, a decree took shape, a plot to destroy every Jew within the empire, young and old, in a single day. It was a darkness disguised as order, a storm clothed in law. The day that decree was sealed, the city changed. Susa, once alive with color, grew heavy with fear. Whispers traveled faster than messengers, and grief moved quietly through the streets. At the gates, Mordecai tore his clothes, covered himself with ashes, and cried out, not for himself, but for his people. He could not enter the palace in mourning, but he stayed near, waiting for a way to reach Esther. Somewhere behind those walls, the one chosen to intercede was already weeping without knowing why. News travels not only by word, but by ache. Esther felt it before she was told. Something in her spirit turned restless, a tremor of sorrow that had no voice yet. When her attendants came and spoke of Mordecai's mourning, her heart tightened. She sent garments for him to wear, thinking perhaps grief had found him for a personal loss. But he refused them. Only then did the message come, written by trembling hands, delivered through servants who feared to speak. And when Esther unrolled the scroll, the words struck her like cold wind. A decree has been sealed by the king. On the 13th day of the 12th month, our people are to be destroyed, every man, woman, and child. Her hands shook as she read. The letters blurred through tears. The room around her seemed to vanish. The silks, the perfumes, the gold, none of it meant anything now. She sent word back to Mordecai, her heart heavy with disbelief. "What can I do?" she asked. "The law forbids anyone to enter the king's presence uninvited. If I go to him uncalled, I will die." The reply came swiftly, as though carried by more than human urgency. "Do not think that you will escape because you are in the king's house. For if you remain silent at this time, deliverance will arise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Those words hung in the still air of her chamber, heavy, holy, impossible. For such a time as this. The phrase echoed, growing softer each time until it was no longer a command, but a calling. Esther closed her eyes and let silence do its work. She could feel the weight of fear pressing at the edges of faith, each thought a tremor of human weakness, each breath an act of surrender. The walls seemed to listen. Even the lamps burned lower, their light softening as though bowing to her moment of decision. She knelt upon the cold marble floor. The stone steadied her trembling hands. She whispered into the hush, "Lord, I cannot do this alone. If you have placed me here, then give me the strength to stand." Her tears fell soundless onto the stone, and where they landed, peace began to bloom, not loudly, but as a warmth beneath the ribs, a still voice within the storm. She knew what she must do. But first, she would fast and pray, 3 days of silence before courage would rise. 3 nights to trade fear for faith. 3 dawns to prepare her heart to meet the King, and the destiny God had written through her life. Let this truth rest in you tonight. That courage does not mean the absence of fear, it means walking with faith through it. The same God who prepared Esther's crown is preparing your strength, even now, in the quiet. Take one slow breath. And another. You are not alone in your waiting. You are being prepared for such a time as this. Night settled over Susa like a veil of indigo. Lanterns flickered along colonnades, and courtyards exhaled the perfume of myrrh and crushed jasmine. Within the palace, the hum of servants softened to a hush. Somewhere a fountain kept its measured speech, silver threads falling into a dark bowl. Beneath that quiet, a deeper silence began, the kind chosen, not merely given. Esther sent word to Mordecai, "Gather our people. Let them fast with me 3 days and 3 nights. No food, no drink. I and my attendants will fast also. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." The message moved like a flame passed from wick to wick. Doorways opened and closed. Hands stilled upon tasks. A city that knew feasts learned a different table, the table of restraint. In homes lit by small bowls of oil, mothers folded their hands, fathers bowed their heads, children grew quiet without being told why. Hunger arrived, gentle at first, then honest. And in that holy ache, petitions lifted like incense. Steady, unseen, unstoppable. In the women's court, Esther's attendants spread a simple mat upon the floor of her chamber. Silk lay untouched. Trays of delicacies cooled and were carried away. The crown rested on a low stool, a circle of gold that seemed humbler without music and applause. Esther stepped barefoot onto the stone. The floor held her, firm, indifferent to fear, faithful as ground. She drew her robe close and knelt. Around her, the room dimmed to a pool of lamplight. Shadows climbed pillars and paused as if to keep watch. The hush took shape, almost a presence, like a messenger who had entered and closed the door softly behind. Esther bowed her head until her forehead touched the mat. No rehearsed words. Only breath, gathering depth. Prayer began as a current beneath thought, slow, sincere, plain. She remembered the psalms Mordecai had taught in childhood. The Lord is a refuge, a fortress, a shield. He is near to the broken-hearted. He delivers those who call. The lines came like steps on a narrow stair, faithful and familiar, carrying her upward. Between them, silence, the spacious room where trust sits and refuses to be hurried. Meanwhile, beyond the inner walls, Mordecai moved along the streets draped in sackcloth. Ashes marked his brow. He did not plead for favor with men. He joined the river of petitions flowing toward God. Neighbors who once passed with nods now stopped beside him and wept. Some had little words, others had none. Both were heard. Night after night they stood together beneath the same patient moon, and the city's sorrow learned harmony, laments laid upon the one chord of hope. On the second day, hunger sharpened the body's edges. Hands trembled when lifting water jars they would not drink from. Yet with every tremble came a steadier resolve. Fasting did not weaken them, it clarified them. The soul, unclouded by comfort, could see the line it must walk. Esther rose to pace the chamber in slow circles. With each step, a fear presented itself and was gently set down. What if the king refuses? What if Haman's rage swells? What if this quiet ends in silence of another kind? At each what if, she let the breath arrive, and leave, and arrive again. Not denial, not bravado, surrender. Courage was forming not like thunder, but like dawn. Her attendants, themselves fasting, learned to serve without movement. One stood near the window and watched darkness fold the city. Another held the small lamp when its wick faltered and trimmed it just enough to glow again. Service became liturgy. Every restraint was an offering: the untouched cup, the folded bread, the sealed spice jar, the feet that refused to wander. When their legs ached, they blessed the ache. When their mouths dried, they let silence be their drink. On the third morning, the palace woke to a paler light. A mist clung to stone like a soft confession. In the gate, Mordecai lifted his face and whispered the shortest prayer he had, a single name, offered like a seed. Within the chamber, Esther listened to the last measures of her hunger and found that in its hollow a mighty room had been built. There, the fear could enter and kneel, not to terror, but to God. She bathed, not as preparation for display, but as cleansing for obedience. Water ran cool over wrists and brow, and it felt like a vow. Her attendants brought garments, not the loudest silks, but a robe that spoke in soft lines. They combed her hair and set the crown upon it, and even the gold seemed solemn, as if learning reverence. At the mirror, her reflection held both tremble and trust. How strange to see them share a face without argument. She lifted her eyes once, steady and low, and let them rest there, where surrender looks like peace. Then she stood. The room breathed with her. Beyond the door waited corridors, beyond the corridors the court, beyond the court the throne room where law and risk held counsel. Beyond that, God. There is a kind of courage that raises banners and gathers armies. And there is another kind that opens a door quietly and walks through. Esther chose the second. She turned the latch. The hinge gave its small sigh, and history leaned closer. Servants along the passage stilled as she passed. Some lowered their eyes, some could not help lifting them. No heralds ran ahead, no trumpets taught the air how to behave. Only the tap of her steps upon stone, a metronome set to the speed of obedience. At the final arch, the throne room opened like a sea of marble and gold. Columns rose like trees in a stylized forest. Lamps translated flame into fragrant light. Officials arranged themselves along the edges, a painted silence waiting for instruction. At the far end, the king on his seat, the measure of distance, the keeper of law. Above him, a canopy stitched with scenes of conquest. Beside him, the scepter, sun caught in metal. Esther paused on the threshold, not for doubt, but for breath. 1,000 eyes could not weigh as much as one unseen gaze. She let that gaze be her gravity. Then she stepped forward. 1, 2, 3. The law tightened like a drawn bow. Time slowed to a low hum. The king's face lifted. Recognition flickered, then the unreadable stillness of power considering risk. The scepter lay in his right hand, tilted toward the floor, and in the space of a heartbeat it could rise or remain. All the prayers of the streets, the midnight petitions, the 3-day hunger, the tears on stone, they came and stood with her, not as noise, but as weight. The room, heavy with gold, waited to see if mercy had heavier hands. Before the scepter moved, a memory crossed Esther's mind like a dove. Mordecai's words, "Quieter now, deeper now. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" The phrase was no longer a question. It was an anchor. Her shoulders lowered half a breath. Her hands softened. She lifted her gaze, not high, not defiant, simply true. And the king, reading what the world rarely sees written so plainly, answered with movement. The scepter rose. Slowly, surely, and leaned toward her. Mercy touched the law. Law made room. History exhaled. Esther advanced and reached, the gold cool beneath her fingertips, a fleeting contact, yet enough. Life, given back by a gesture, returned with purpose. The court found its breath. The lamps, though unchanged, seemed brighter. Somewhere a robe rustled in relief, and even that sound felt like prayer. Queen Esther, the king's voice traveled without hardness. "What is it, and what is your request?" The words fell like rain on soil ready to receive. But the answer, the boldness, the strategy, the deliverance, belonged to another hour. For now, courage had crossed the first threshold. Grace had opened the door. Let the third day's quiet fire rest in you. Courage may be born in a whisper, carried by fasting, sealed by a single step. When the moment arrives, the rock beneath your trembling will hold. Mercy can lift the scepter, and law, in the hands of God, can learn to make room for life. Breathe slowly. Let obedience and peace share the same heartbeat. You are being held for such a time as this. The throne room was a world of stillness. Every sound that had lived in that space, every whisper, every shuffle, every breath, seemed to pause, as if waiting for permission to exist again. Esther stood at the edge of life and death, her heart steady now, her fear softened into focus. She did not tremble, not because she was fearless, but because faith had filled the space where fear once lived. The golden scepter gleamed between them, a single thread of light stretching from the hand of power to the hand of obedience. The king's eyes, once distant, softened as they met hers. Something unseen passed between them, not persuasion, not beauty, but grace. He extended his arm fully, and the gold touched air like a sunrise touching horizon. Esther bowed low, and as her fingertips brushed the scepter's edge, the world resumed its breath. It was the smallest motion, yet it carried the weight of heaven's timing. The king spoke, his voice filling the vast marble chamber. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" "It shall be given to you, even up to half of the kingdom." Oi! In that moment, courage could have spoken boldly. Fear could have rushed her to reveal the plan, to cry out the truth, to plead for her people. But wisdom, guided by God, held her words. Deliverance often moves slower than urgency would prefer, because God's strategy is not speed, it is perfection. Esther raised her eyes, and her voice came softly, almost like a prayer wrapped in humility. "If it pleases the king," she said, "let the king and Haman come today to the banquet I have prepared for you." Her tone was calm, but beneath that calm, her faith was alive, a flame steady enough to light the path ahead. The king turned to his servants and said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." And so, the three of them met that evening, the king, the queen, and the man whose pride would soon meet its undoing. The banquet chamber glowed with soft lamps and folded silks. Music drifted like incense, filling the air with slow comfort. Haman smiled as he entered, his confidence heavy and bright. To dine with the king was honor, but to be invited by the queen herself, that was vanity's sweetest wine. He did not see the divine hand behind the invitation, nor hear the faint rhythm of justice beginning to beat beneath his triumph. Esther sat in quiet grace, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes lowered as though listening to something no one else could hear. She served, she smiled, she watched. And though her heart beat strong within her chest, peace moved through her like slow water. The king, pleased and content, turned to her and said again, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" "It shall be granted to you." "What is your request?" "Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be done." She met his gaze and replied, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, let the king and Haman come to another banquet which I shall prepare for them. Then I will do as the king has said." The king nodded. There was no tension in his face, no impatience in his tone. Perhaps, even without knowing it, he was already being guided by the same unseen hand that guided her. When the evening ended, Haman walked through the gates intoxicated with pride. The city seemed to bow to him, the air itself appeared to part before his steps. But when he passed the king's gate and saw Mordecai still standing, unbent, unafraid, his joy curdled into rage. He went home burning with indignation, and his family fed that fire. "Build gallows," they said, 50 cubits high. Ask the king in the morning to hang Mordecai there. Then go to the banquet with joy. Haman smiled, and the hammers began to strike through the night, a rhythm of pride building its own destruction. But in the palace, Esther did not sleep. She knelt once more before the window where the city lights shimmered below, and she prayed in whispers that melted into tears. She did not ask for safety, only for strength to speak when the moment arrived. She knew her courage had opened the door. Now faith would have to walk through it. God's plan was moving, quietly, perfectly, and she would be ready when the time came. In the king's chamber, sleep also fled. The night pressed long and restless upon his spirit. He rose from bed and called for the scrolls of remembrance, records of those who had served him faithfully. As servants read by lamplight, a name surfaced from the ink of forgotten deeds: Mordecai, the man who had once exposed a plot to kill the king. And the king asked, "What honor has been shown to this man?" "None," they replied. The king leaned back in silence, his thoughts threading quietly toward dawn. By morning, favor, and justice were already being rearranged. The night between the two banquets was a bridge, a fragile silence where heaven worked unseen. Haman slept in pride. Esther prayed in peace. The king lay awake in curiosity. And God, who neither slumbers nor forgets, was setting every piece exactly where it belonged. Let that truth cradle you tonight. Even when you cannot see His hand, God is still moving the story toward mercy. Your waiting is not wasted. Your obedience is never unseen. Rest in the quiet between, the sacred pause where miracles begin. Morning slipped into the palace like a careful guest. Its light laid softly upon bronze shields and quiet tapestries, and the long corridors woke with the smallest of sounds, a sandal, a whisper, a door easing open to let the day through. In the hush before decisions, a king sat with a question. All night the record keepers had read by lamp, and a forgotten deed had risen from ink like a dove from ashes. Mordecai, the man who had warned of treachery and saved the king's life. What honor has been done for him? The king had asked, and the answer, none, had lingered in the room like unfinished music. Now the sun touched the window grills, and the king's spirit would not allow delay. Who is in the court? He asked. Servants glanced toward the outer hall, where another early guest had arrived with urgency stitched into his stride. Haman stood waiting, heart loud with plans, tongue ready to request a single, terrible permission. He had come to ask for Mordecai's death. But Providence keeps its own appointments. Let him come in, said the king. And Haman entered, bowing low, certain that morning itself was on his side. Before he could speak, the king posed his question, a question that turned corridors into altars and pride into a mirror. What shall be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman's heart swelled like an overfilled wineskin. Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? His thought purred. So he dreamed aloud the rewards he most desired, a royal robe that the king himself had worn. A horse the king had ridden, bearing the royal crest. A noble prince leading the honored one through the city square, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man the king delights to honor." The king listened, and the morning held its breath. "Excellent," he said at last. "Hurry. Take the robe and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not omit a single thing you have suggested." Oi! Silence can be loud. It rang now like a bell within Haman's skull. The robe he had measured with his mind now hung on another's shoulders. The horse he had imagined beneath himself lowered its head for another's hand. And he, a prince swollen with rage, must become the herald of the very man his hatred sought to erase. Outside, the city blinked in new light as Haman approached Mordecai with hands that obeyed while his heart rebelled. He lifted the fine robe, woven with the vocabulary of kings, and placed it across the shoulders of a gatekeeper who had refused to bend. He guided the royal horse, his fingers finding the bridle as if it resisted him. And then, with a voice that cost him more than all his wealth, he cried through the streets, "Thus shall it be done to the man the king delights to honor." The words spilled like water he could not gather again. They ran over stone and past market and under window, filling Susa with a strange, clean justice. Mothers paused, jars tilted mid-air. Children stared wide-eyed at the procession, Mordecai robed, Mordecai raised, Mordecai honored by the very mouth that had named him enemy. And Mordecai, he sat the horse as quietly as he had sat the gate. When the circuit ended, he returned to his place, the low seat, the faithful watch, as though honor were not crown, but confirmation. Haman fled home with a face that had forgotten how to be proud. His wife and friends listened as he poured out the humiliation, and their counsel, once flattery, turned sober. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jews, you will not overcome him, you will surely fall before him. The words landed like stones. And before he could answer, the king's eunuchs arrived to hurry him to Esther's second banquet. Pride had no time to recover. It was led by the hand to its appointed undoing. In the queen's chamber, the air moved with a different rhythm. Esther's fast had become peace, and peace had become poise. No longer at the mercy of fear, her heart stood within a fortress not made by hands. She arranged the table with quiet intention. Bread enough, wine enough, the simple beauty that makes a room tell the truth. This was not a stage, it was an altar. And she, not an actress, but a servant. She did not know all that the morning had done, the robe, the horse, the public cry, yet her spirit felt the nearness of alignment, as if the earth itself had turned a page and waited for the next line to be written. Mordecai remained at the gate, calm as a rooted tree. He asked for nothing, and heaven considered that beautiful. Honor had visited him and found it had nowhere to cling but humility, so it settled and became quiet strength. Afternoon deepened toward gold. Servants lit lamps that added fragrance rather than heat. The palace rehearsed its gentle noises, soft steps, soft voices, the clink of a pitcher against a rim. Esther breathed a prayer that had only one word in it: help. And help, which needs no trumpet, stood beside her. At the appointed hour, the king entered with Haman. Haman's smile was repaired, but not mended. His eyes moved with the hunted caution of one who feels the ground changing shape beneath him. He could not know that every step carried him closer to the truth he had tried to bury. They reclined. Wine was poured. The first course was given, then the second. Conversation floated like gentle music, each phrase placed where quiet required it. The king turned to Esther, and the tone of his voice was a door opening without creak. "Queen Esther, what is your petition?" "It shall be granted you." "What is your request?" "Even to half of the kingdom, it shall be done." The room did not shrink, it widened. Esther's courage rose, not as fire now, but as clarity. The moment had come, shaped by 3 days of hunger, by a sleepless king, by a humbled enemy, by a robe upon a faithful man. Providence had written the preface. Grace invited the first sentence. She lifted her eyes with the humility of one who knows deliverance belongs to God, and her voice gathered the gentleness of truth. "My life and the lives of my people," she began. But that telling belongs to the next breath, the next page, the next soft unfolding of mercy. Rest here, on the rim of revelation. See how God orders mornings and hearts, kings and questions, robes and roads, not hurried, never late. Pride builds gallows at night, heaven builds deliverance at dawn. And the one who refuses to bow to anything but God finds honor arriving like quiet rain. Breathe slowly. Providence is patient, and its footsteps are already in the hall. Evening gathered its calm around the palace. The lamps along the walls burned low, their light soft and amber. Outside, the city of Susa rested beneath the hush that comes before a change, a stillness that even the winds seemed to honor. Within the banquet chamber, 3 hearts shared one quiet table. The king, steady, watchful. Haman, smiling too quickly, hiding tremors beneath his pride. And Esther, serene, yet aflame with purpose known only to God. The first banquet had been a prelude, this one was an appointed hour. The air carried that sense of holy tension, when heaven leans close to see how faith will speak. The king reclined in comfort, his robe heavy with embroidered gold. He lifted his cup and said again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition?" "It shall be granted you." "And what is your request?" "Even to half of the kingdom, it shall be done." The question hung between them, a bridge between fear and deliverance. Esther's heart beat slow, measured. She felt the warmth of the lamp at her shoulder, the cool of the marble beneath her feet, the steady rhythm of her breath. And within that rhythm, the whisper she had learned to trust, "Now." She rose gently from her seat. Every movement deliberate, reverent, surrendered. She bowed her head once before the king, not as flattery, but as acknowledgement of the moment's weight. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but her words carried the fire of truth. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king," she said, "and if it pleases you, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Had we been sold merely as slaves, I would have held my peace, but our very lives are at stake." The room did not move. Even the air seemed to listen. The king's brow furrowed. He turned sharply toward her, his tone rising like thunder restrained. "Who is he," he said, "and where is he, who has presumed in his heart to do this?" Esther lifted her eyes. They met his without fear. Her words came clear, each syllable wrapped in quiet authority. "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Oi! The name struck the air like a bell of judgment. The silence that followed was not empty, it was divine. Every sound in the room seemed to recoil from the truth. The king's face hardened, his hand clenched upon the table, his eyes bright with disbelief and fury. He rose abruptly, his robe sweeping behind him like a storm about to speak, and he stepped out into the palace garden, a man walking between anger and revelation. Haman froze, his breath shallow, his composure unraveling thread by thread. He turned to Esther, falling to his knees beside the couch where she sat today. The mask of power had broken, all that remained was fear. "Queen," he stammered, "spare me, I did not know. But lies find no footing where truth has already taken root." He reached toward her robe, pleading, trembling. And in that instant, the king returned. The scene before him, the villain bent, the queen recoiling in fear, was enough. The law of pride had written its own sentence. "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" The king's voice cut through the chamber. Before the echo faded, the guards had moved, silent, swift, obedient to justice older than the throne itself. A cloth was drawn over Haman's face, the symbol of shame. Then one of the servants, his voice low but sure, said, "Behold, the gallows that Haman prepared for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king. It stands at his house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on it." Oi. The night closed around the city as judgment was carried out. The same stars that had watched Esther's fasting now witnessed fulfillment. The same wind that had carried her prayers now carried the sound of justice across the rooftops. But inside her chamber, Esther did not rejoice loudly. She knelt. Her tears came not from triumph, but from relief, the kind of weeping that belongs to those who have seen God move and are humbled by His mercy. The crown upon her head felt lighter now, not because it was less, but because its weight had been shared with heaven. She whispered into the stillness, "Thank you, Lord, for strength borrowed and faith returned. You have made a way where none could be seen." Her prayer drifted through the window, out over the quiet city, and rose toward the one who had turned sorrow into salvation. Oi. Outside, the dawn waited beneath the horizon. The gallows stood empty of purpose now, its shadow a reminder that pride always digs its own foundation. But nearby, the gate where Mordecai had once stood humbly was bright with promise. Honor and safety would soon be written into law, and the people would rejoice. For now, though, Susa rested. A queen had spoken, a king had listened, and God, unseen but undeniable, had redeemed His people once again. Let your heart breathe in this quiet victory tonight. It is not always thunder that proves God's power. Sometimes it is a whisper in a room, a word spoken at the right hour, a heart that chooses courage instead of silence. When the moment arrives, you will not stand alone. The same hand that lifted Esther's spirit will steady yours. Night had done its solemn work. And when morning uncurled its soft light over Susa, a quieter world opened its eyes. The air felt rinsed, as though the city itself had wept and then been comforted. Courtyards breathed the scent of wet stone. Sparrows stitched the dawn with simple notes. Somewhere a market tent was lifted and shook free of night, and dust rose like a small prayer. Within the palace, Esther stood once more before the king. The scepter, that slender bridge between death and life, rested in his hand again. He extended it without haste, as a man who has learned the weight of favor. Esther touched the gold and bowed, not with the fear of yesterday, but with the humility of one who knows she has been carried. "Speak, Queen Esther," the king said, voice softened by the night's truth. "What is your petition now, and what is your request?" Her answer rose like a tide that had waited for its hour. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king," she said gently, "let it be written to revoke the letters, the devices of Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews in all the provinces of the king." Her hands remained still, yet her heart leaned forward like a lantern lifting in the dark. "For how can I endure to see the destruction of my people? How can I endure to see the ruin of my kindred?" The room listened. Mercy, having proven itself in a chamber the night before, now sought parchment and seal. The king answered with more than words. He took from his hand the signet ring that Haman had worn, heavy with authority, and placed it upon Mordecai's hand. Power changed houses as quietly as dawn changes color. "Mordecai shall write," the king said, "as seems good to you, concerning the Jews, in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring." For an edict written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may not be revoked, but a new word may be sent. So messengers were summoned, swift riders, the best in the provinces, their horses pouring the stone as if impatient for hope. Scribes gathered with fresh scrolls and clean ink. The smell of reed pens and warmed wax filled the hall. Mordecai stood with a calm that looked like river water, steady on the surface, deep with current below. He dictated not in haste, but with clarity, and the scribe's hands kept pace with purpose. The new decree did not chase the old with panic. It answered it with truth. On the day appointed by the first letter, the Jews in every city were granted the right to assemble and stand for their lives, to protect their households and their children, to resist any hand raised against them. The word was not vengeance, it was permission to live. Seals were pressed. String was tied. Wax cooled into certainty. Then the riders flew, out through the palace gates, down the marble ramps, and onto the King's Road, the sound of hooves ringing like bells of deliverance. North toward the mountain provinces, south to riverlands, east to deserts that swallowed miles, west to shores where salt learned to glitter again, the message went. Hope began to travel faster than fear. When the work was done, the king clothed Mordecai in garments of royal blue and white, and set upon him a great crown of gold. A mantle of fine linen and purple fell from his shoulders in quiet folds. Honor did not inflate him, it fitted him. He walked out into the city the way a tree stands upright after rain, not taller, but truer. Susa saw and rejoiced. Lamps were kindled in daylight, not to push back night, but to celebrate the returning of safety. Streets that had learned whispering now learned singing. Courtyards filled with the clatter of pots and laughter that sounded like unfastened burdens. Many who had felt far from the Jews drew near to them that day. For joy is a wide door and sorrow had been a shared house. And the scripture would one day say it simply, for the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. But in the moment, it felt like bread warm from an oven placed into open hands. Esther stepped back from the window and let the sound of the city be her hymn. She did not think of herself as the heroine of a tale. She thought of the mercy that had made the tale possible. Her crown seemed lighter again, not because its gold had thinned, but because its meaning had deepened. It had become an instrument of protection, a tool of peace. She whispered, "Thank you," and the word found its way into every corridor like a soft, agreeable wind. Mordecai returned to the gate, not to shrink from honor, but to steward it. He took the same place where he had once sat forgotten, and his presence, crowned now, did not alter the posture of his heart. He greeted those who passed. He listened as he had always listened. He kept watch, not for his name, but for his people. Greatness, when it is genuine, moves like water into low places. Far out on the roads, riders slowed only to change horses. In province after province, governors broke wax and unrolled the new decree. Faces that had tightened with dread eased like knots unwound. Fathers embraced sons with a fierceness that sounded like gratitude. Mothers gathered children close and spoke blessing over hair that smelled of sun. In some towns, strangers placed food upon doorsteps and slipped away before thanks could find them. Joy learns quiet ways to be generous. And still the parchment traveled, the king's name bright at the top, the seal shining where light touched it, a circle of certainty against the uncertainty of men. Fear began to retreat the way tide concedes to shore, not in an instant, but with faithful steps backward. As evening fell, Susa glowed again, not with the grand bravado of feasts, but with the gentler brightness of homes relit after a long dark. From many doorways, songs rose, not loud, not for show, family tones, neighbor tones, the sound of a people rediscovering a future. The city's night wore colors, light and gladness and joy and honor woven together like a cloak warmed by many shoulders. Esther rested her hands on the window ledge and felt the stone cool beneath her palms. She thought of the 3 days of fasting, how hunger had hollowed a room inside her that God then filled with courage. She thought of the 2 banquets, how patience had become strategy, and strategy had become salvation. She thought of the sleepless king, the humbled enemy, the honored gatekeeper. And over it all, she sensed the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps, whose edicts of mercy cannot be revoked. Let them be safe, she breathed. Let them be safe, and let our hearts never forget why. Oi! Night gathered, but it had lost its power to threaten. The new decree lay under moonlight in 100 towns, the king's riders still a silver dust on distant roads. Somewhere a mother tucked a child into bed and said, "Tomorrow," with confidence. Somewhere a father folded a parchment and placed it where his hands could find it at dawn. And overhead, the stars agreed with the earth, the story had bent toward life. Let this peace lean over you now. There are edicts the world writes in fear, and there are answers God writes in love. What cannot be revoked by man can be redeemed by heaven, not always by erasing the line, but by inscribing beneath it a truer word. Breathe. Let hope become law within your chest. Let light and gladness and joy and honor be the colors of your night. The day that had been feared finally dawned. The 13th day of the 12th month, the day the decree of death had named. The sun rose golden over the city of Susa, its light touching rooftops that had once trembled at the mention of that date. But now, that same day carried a different rhythm, a stillness before the melody of deliverance. In every province, in every city and village, the Jews stood together, no longer in hiding, no longer waiting for despair. Their hearts, once tight with fear, beat in the calm of readiness. They were not a people of vengeance, but a people who had remembered how to pray with their eyes open. The decree that had once promised their destruction had been answered by another, the law of defense, the law of life. The city of Susa stirred early. Soldiers moved through the streets, not to threaten, but to guard. Neighbors who had once looked away now stood near, their gazes softer, their hands steady. The shadow that had stretched over them for months lifted like a curtain pulled back to reveal morning. And as the sun rose higher, a strange sound filled the air, not the clang of battle, but the hum of peace taking root. In her chamber, Esther watched from the window. The palace grounds below shimmered with early light, and she felt her own breath match the rhythm of the day, slow, reverent, free. She thought of the countless prayers that had filled the night before, the countless candles burning in small homes across the city, each flame a plea, each flicker a declaration of trust. Now, the city glowed brighter than any flame could offer. Deliverance had arrived, not as chaos, but as calm, as the quiet assurance that comes when fear has finally found its end. Mordecai stood again at the gate, his robe of blue and white moving gently in the morning wind. He had no sword, no guards of his own, his presence was enough. Those who passed bowed to him, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. In him, they saw what faith looks like when it stands through storm and sunlight alike. He greeted each man who came, his words few, his eyes bright. To one who trembled he said, "Peace." To another who asked what would come next, he said, "Life." And to all who looked at him as if for permission to hope, he smiled and said, "God remembers." Oi. Throughout the kingdom, the same story unfolded, not with the roar of armies, but with the steady unfolding of protection. In each city, the Jews gathered, strengthened not only by decree, but by unity. Those who had once feared them now respected them, for it was clear to all that divine favor rested upon them. No weapon raised against them prevailed. No accusation found ground to stand upon. Instead, peace flowed through the empire like a river rediscovering its path. And as the day waned, the noise of fear was replaced by laughter, a sound that had forgotten how to exist but now returned with warmth. Children ran through the streets again. Markets reopened. The smell of bread returned to the air. Life, simple, precious life, resumed its holy rhythm. In the palace, as evening fell, Esther and Mordecai met in the courtyard. The last light of day stretched across the stones, painting everything in hues of gold and violet. They stood side by side for a while without speaking. Words were unnecessary between two hearts that had already said yes to God's plan. At last, Esther spoke softly, "It is finished." Mordecai nodded. "No," he said gently. "It has just begun." She smiled, understanding. Deliverance was not only freedom from death, it was the beginning of remembrance, the moment when gratitude becomes tradition, when history becomes a hymn. He continued, "This day will not be forgotten. It will become a feast, a celebration of God's hidden faithfulness. We will teach our children to remember it, so that they, too, will know that courage and trust can turn even decrees of death into promises of life." Esther closed her eyes, the word remember ringing softly in her spirit. In that quiet, she felt the truth settle deep within her, that God's deliverance is not only for the moment, but for generations yet to come. That night, as the city celebrated, Esther walked once more to her window. Lanterns glowed in every home below, their lights swaying like stars that had come down to dance among the people. Laughter drifted upward, mingled with music and song. The notes rose and fell like the sea, waves of joy washing over walls that had once known only fear. She whispered, "For such a time as this," and the words no longer sounded heavy. They were light now, a benediction over everything that had unfolded. The story of Esther had become more than survival. It had become a pattern, a reminder that God's purposes often move through quiet hearts, through unseen hours, through trembling hands that choose obedience over ease. Deliverance, she realized, was not the end of the story, but the continuation of grace. Let that same peace settle upon you now. The day once meant for despair has become a day of joy. Where there was fear, there is faith. Where there was threat, there is promise. Where there was silence, there is song. You are not forgotten. You are not without deliverance. The same God who turned death into celebration for Esther and her people is writing deliverance into your own story, quietly, patiently, perfectly. Rest in that truth tonight. and let joy, gentle and sure, become the crown upon your spirit. Even after the day of deliverance, the air of Susa kept a soft brightness. Shops reopened like smiles. Doorways filled with neighbors who had learned each other's names in the long night of fear. Children traced new games in dust the rain had left tender, and every chalked line felt like a boundary returned to peace. Mordecai walked through the streets in the calm of purpose. Honor had not made him taller, it had made him quieter. Wherever he paused, gratitude gathered. Hands reached to touch his sleeve, not to claim him, but to thank the God who had preserved them through a servant who would not bow to pride. He blessed each one, a baker wiping flour from his hands, an elderly widow leaning on the arm of a grandson, a soldier whose face, unguarded now, showed relief that looked like youth. In the palace, Esther watched the city breathe. The music of ordinary hours returned, water poured from jar to cup, bread broken and passed, laughter sewing itself back into the seams of the day. She placed her palm on the window stone and let its coolness steady her joy. Deliverance, she knew, must learn to become remembrance, or fear, someday, might learn to return. Letters were drafted. Messengers waited, horses stamping softly as if they too felt the eagerness of a new chapter. Mordecai took up the work with the same care he had given to the gate. No flourish, only fidelity. Scribes sharpened reeds, wax warmed in small bronze bowls. The king's seal lay ready beside the scrolls. The letters spoke simply, and therefore powerfully. They named the days that sorrow had chosen and renamed them for joy. They invited the scattered families of the covenant to rest on those days, to feast, to send portions of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. Deliverance would not end at the edge of safe homes. It would travel to doors that had little and fill them. A festival would be born, not of triumph's noise, but of gratitude's quiet wealth. Couriers departed in every direction, north where the hills hold the cool of evening, south where rivers shine like threads, east through dry places that make water sing louder, west toward the sea that remembers every story the wind has told it. Wherever the letters were opened, eyes softened. Mothers exhaled a prayer they had not known they were still holding. Fathers lifted children to read the good words aloud again, as if repetition might braid safety into their very bones. And when night fell in far villages, lamps glowed in synchronized gladness, small constellations on earth answering the constellations above. In Susa, preparations began gently. No trumpet announced them, no order compelled them. Bread rose in ovens, rounds brushed with oil until they shone like moons. Dates were pressed into sweets, figs were split and filled with almonds. Kettles murmured, herbs gave up their green perfume. Women set aside extra portions, smiling at the thought of a widow's surprise or a shy child's delight. Children practiced carrying baskets without peeking beneath the cloth. They did peek, of course. And then laughed, and then promised not to again. Old stories were rehearsed at low tables, of seas that once stood aside, of cities circled with song, and now of a queen who fasted, a watchman who would not bend, a scepter that learned to lean. The youngest ones asked to hear the part where fear turned into food. And it was told, with chuckles and tears and the kind of pauses where the room listens for God and finds Him present. When the appointed days arrived, the city learned a new Sabbath of the heart. Work stood still without resentment. Doors stayed open. Tables widened. Some feasts were large and loud with families gathered shoulder to shoulder. Others were simple, a single candle, a single bowl shared and filled again by a neighbor's knock. Into rich homes came the poor. From poor homes went gifts that cost more because they were small. Joy made everyone generous in the way rain makes hills kind. Esther did not sit apart. She moved quietly through halls and courts, pausing to greet attendants by name, sharing fruit with a child who could not decide whether to eat or simply stare at the queen's smile. She sent baskets where grief still lived, to a mother whose husband had not survived the long night of worry, to a man who owned little more than hope and now found his hands full. Her joy was not a crown she wore, it was bread she gave away. Mordecai, from the gate, watched the river of kindness find its channels. He saw disputes dissolve in embrace, old grudges loosen like knots in wet rope. He saw strangers laugh together as if they had practiced for years. And he lifted his face and let the sun write warmth across it, an ink that does not fade. The letters Esther and Mordecai sent were sent again, not as edicts this time, but as confirmations. They asked that the days be kept each year, in their seasons, as a memorial across generations, that sons would ask fathers why, and fathers would answer with the story of hidden providence, that daughters would ask mothers how, and mothers would answer, with fasting, then courage, then the gentle strength of patience. The feast would be named for the lot that once sought to end them, and in the naming, the threat would be humbled, turned to a reminder that God writes last. So it was settled, with ink and with custom and with the hush of a people agreeing together. These will be the days when fear is not allowed to speak loudly. These will be the days when tables remember the poor. These will be the days when laughter is worship and sleep is safe. As night eased over Susa, the second of the 2 days folded itself like soft cloth into memory. Lanterns swung gently in doorways. A shepherd's flute wandered over rooftops and did not need to find its way. The city itself was a song. Esther returned to her window, a habit now woven of gratitude. She rested her forehead against the cool stone and let the sounds below become prayer. No words were necessary. The feast itself spoke. God remembered. God delivered. God taught us to share what He saved. She thought of the first day in the palace when the corridors seemed longer than courage. She thought of the nights of fasting when hunger hollowed a room where God could live more largely. She thought of the scepter, the garden's silence, the gallows emptied of its boast, the ring that changed hands, the letters that turned death into duty to live. Each memory placed another stone in an altar the heart can carry and never drop. Mordecai, finishing his watch, looked once more across the city before stepping inside. He did not count victories, he counted mercies. He did not ask to be remembered, he asked that the feast would be kept. And heaven, which numbers hares and sparrows and sighs, marked his prayer and folded it among promises. So the days of sorrow were reversed, and rest learned to remain. Not as a fragile truce, but as a practiced trust, the kind that knows whom to thank and how to keep thanking. The people slept early that night, full but not heavy, laughing softly even as they doused lamps. In dreams, children walked streets where fear had no address. In dreams, elders sat under vines and did not look over their shoulders. In dreams, the Rock of Ages wore a crown of ordinary light and was at home among them. Let this feast of remembering reach you now. Let fear's old date lose its power as gratitude names your days. Let rest become a rhythm, generosity a habit, and joy a law written not on paper alone but upon the quiet of your chest. The God who turned mourning into dancing for Esther's people does not forget the doorways of today. Breathe. Receive your portion of peace. And when you can, pass a portion on. Days became weeks, and weeks folded into months. The kingdom of Persia, vast and bright beneath the sun, settled into a season of calm. The drums of decree no longer echoed through the streets. The scrolls that had once carried dread now lay sealed in archives, preserved not as threats, but as testimonies. Susa, once a city trembling under fear's shadow, now moved with a gentler rhythm, the rhythm of peace rediscovered. Esther's name was known from gate to gate, but she wore her fame like a veil, visible, yet never clutched. She still rose early, before the hall stirred with servants, and stood by the same window where her prayers had first learned the shape of surrender. From there, she could see the distant gate, where Mordecai stood each morning, the man who had taught her to trust before understanding. Sometimes she watched him without calling for him. His stillness comforted her. He was the same as he had always been, faithful, watchful, content to serve without applause. Now dressed in the royal colors of blue and white, he carried the king's authority, but his steps remained humble, his eyes steady. The people loved him for it. To them, he was not just a ruler, he was proof that honor could dwell with humility. In the royal court, life returned to its careful order. Petitions came and went, trade routes reopened, and foreign envoys brought gifts with words of peace. The king, tempered by all he had witnessed, spoke less of conquest and more of justice. And in quiet moments, he would glance toward Esther, his gaze thoughtful, as though he, too, had begun to recognize that wisdom wears gentleness as its crown. She sat beside him at councils, her counsel always soft-spoken but deeply heard. When others argued for gain or glory, her words reminded them of mercy. When men spoke of numbers and strength, she spoke of the unseen, the value of a nation at peace, the cost of a conscience neglected. And when the king nodded, scribes wrote her words into policy, proof that a woman who listens for God can alter the rhythm of an empire. Outside the palace walls, the Feast of Purim became more than a celebration. It became a language of faith. Each year, when the month of Adar returned, families gathered not only to remember their rescue, but to relearn how to rejoice. Children dressed in colors bright as sunrise. Musicians tuned instruments that had been silent through the years of fear. Women baked with laughter, men gave with ease. Esther's story was told in the marketplaces, not with embellishment, but with tenderness. They said her name as one says light. And whenever they spoke of courage, they added the word faith beside it, for they had learned the two are never separate. Within the palace, Esther's days grew simpler, though her surroundings remained splendid. She still tended her gardens, her sanctuary between council and ceremony. There, the air smelled of fig and rose. She often sat near the fountain's edge, the water speaking softly as it fell, reminding her of prayer, of the constancy that had carried her. Sometimes, she thought of the girl she had been, the orphan in a foreign land, drawn into a world she had not chosen. How strange, she would think, that the God who had felt distant in those first fearful nights had been shaping every step, every delay, every silence. What had felt like exile had become placement. What had seemed like loss had become purpose. She smiled, her reflection shimmering in the water's surface. The crown, faintly mirrored, seemed less a symbol of power now and more a quiet reminder of trust fulfilled. Mordecai often joined her in those gardens at twilight. Their conversations were short, not from distance, but from the kind of closeness that needs few words. He would bring updates from the city, reports of peace, stories of kindness multiplying, letters from distant provinces expressing gratitude. Once, as the sun sank low, Esther turned to him and asked, "Do you ever wonder why it had to be us?" He smiled. "Not anymore," he said. "The wondering is for those who are still waiting for their turn. We have seen enough to know, God chooses whom He will, and when He does, the ordinary becomes enough." She nodded, his words like cool water on the heart. For a while, they sat in silence, the air humming with cicadas, the sky turning amber and lavender above the palace walls. When Mordecai rose to leave, he bowed, not out of duty, but affection. And she, watching him walk away, whispered the same words she had spoken on the night before her courage was tested. "If you are with me, Lord, I will not need to be strong." The sentence still felt true, even after victory, even after peace. Time, in its patient way, began to carry her story into legend. But Esther did not live for legend. She lived for faith, for mornings filled with gratitude, for nights filled with quiet reflection. And if travelers passing through Persia spoke her name, she hoped they would remember not her beauty, not her crown, but her obedience. Because it was obedience, not boldness alone, that had turned fear into faith, and danger into deliverance. Let this part of her story rest gently within you tonight. The miracle of Esther's life was not in the palace walls or royal decree, but in the still heart that listened and said yes. The crown she wore did not make her queen, it only revealed what courage and trust had already made her. So, when your own heart stands in quiet waiting, remember her. You do not need to see the whole story to trust the author. You only need to keep saying yes, one breath, one prayer, one act of faith at a time. Breathe softly now. And let peace, not pride, be your crown tonight. The God who lifted Esther to her purpose is the same who steadies you, quietly, completely, for such a time as this. The years moved softly through the palace. Not in grand fanfare, but in seasons of calm. The gardens deepened their roots, the fountains sang their steady hymns, and Esther's heart, once tested by storm, learned the quiet joy of sunlight that stays. She had known fear. She had known fasting and trembling and sleepless nights. But now, she knew something greater, the still faith that follows deliverance, the kind that does not fade when danger has passed. Faith that endures not in crisis, but in contentment. Faith that keeps watch when the world grows gentle again. Each morning she would rise before dawn. The corridors, still wrapped in shadow, welcomed her steps as though they remembered her prayers. She would pause at the same window she had once looked through in desperation, and now looked through in gratitude. The city below, once tense with silence, now hummed with ordinary life, the sound of merchants setting out wares, the cry of children running to meet the day, the music of a world restored. Esther would press her palm against the cool stone of the window frame and whisper the same simple prayer, "Thank you, Lord, that you remember." Oi. Sometimes, letters came from distant provinces, scrolls sealed with colored wax and careful script. They carried stories from the Jewish families scattered across the empire. Stories of feasts still kept, of laughter shared, of children learning why bread was broken, why gifts were given. They called her the Mother of Deliverance, though she never claimed the title. She would touch the parchment gently and smile, knowing the truest reward of faith is not fame, but fruit, the life that continues after obedience has done its work. When the Feast of Purim returned each year, the palace filled with music again. Trumpets called across courtyards, candles glowed against golden walls. Servants placed bowls of fruit upon tables, and laughter, real, free laughter, filled the spaces once haunted by worry. Esther joined her people in spirit, her heart lifted with theirs in thanksgiving. She knew that the feast did not belong to her, but to the faithfulness of God. And in the quiet after the songs, when the palace grew still and torches burned low, she would walk the garden paths and listen, for she had learned that peace also has its language. The wind through palm leaves, the ripple of water, the steady beat of her own heart, these were her psalms now. Mordecai aged gently. His beard turned silver, his hands slower but no less steady. He remained at the king's gate, still serving, still guiding, still praying. When Esther visited him, they spoke little, for their understanding ran deeper than words. Sometimes they simply sat together, watching the sun slide low across the horizon, the light touching both palace and gate alike. "Do you ever tire of watching?" she asked him once, her voice soft as the wind that moved between them. He smiled. "Never," he said. "To watch is to trust, to stay awake to what God is doing, even when the world forgets to look." Esther nodded. The wisdom in his tone settled into her spirit like a seed, a reminder that faith does not always act, sometimes it simply remains. In the later years of her reign, Esther was known for her compassion. Petitioners came before her not with fear, but with hope. She listened to widows, to farmers, to merchants burdened by taxes. Her words carried the same gentleness that had once turned the heart of a king. Even her attendants noticed the difference in her presence, that when she entered a room, it felt as though peace entered with her. When asked where her wisdom came from, she never spoke of crowns or decrees. She said, "From waiting. From learning that silence and prayer are not emptiness, they are where God speaks most clearly." Her reign became known as the season of peace, not because wars had ceased, but because the people's hearts had learned to rest. And rest, she knew, is the true sign of divine rule. At night, she sometimes walked the upper terraces alone. The sky above Persia stretched endless, the same sky that had watched her fast, the same stars that had blinked through the garden shadows when she first said, "If I perish, I perish." Now, their light no longer felt distant. They seemed closer, almost tender, as if heaven itself was leaning nearer in gratitude. She whispered again into the quiet, "Everything you promised, you fulfilled. Everything I feared, you redeemed. Everything I gave, you multiplied." Her words carried on the breeze, weaving through cypress and cedar, until the night itself seemed to answer, not with sound, but with stillness. Years would pass. New rulers would rise. New challenges would come. But Esther's story would remain, not written only on scrolls, but on hearts that had learned what trust can do when fear says it cannot. Mothers would tell daughters about her courage, and fathers would tell sons about her faith. And every time her name was spoken, it would sound less like history and more like hope. Let your heart rest in that hope tonight. Faith is not a single act of bravery, but a lifelong surrender. It is the quiet strength that chooses trust again and again, even when the danger has passed, even when life feels safe again. The God who stayed with Esther through silence and storm is the same who abides with you in peace and waiting. He is as present in stillness as he is in deliverance. So breathe. Let the years of your own story unfold gently. Do not rush the calm that follows obedience. It, too, is holy. For even when the world forgets to look, God remembers. And faith, when it remains, becomes its own kind of crown. Days found their measured rhythm again. Sunlight stepped softly across the palace floors in the morning, and evening drew its lavender hush over gardens that remembered prayers. The world did not tremble now. It breathed. Esther walked the quiet paths where fountains spoke in low, silver voices. The air was fragrant with fig and myrtle. Doves nested in the cypress as if peace had become a place with an address. Everywhere she turned, remembrance waited, not as noise, but as warmth, the window where fasting had become courage, the doorway where she had paused before the throne room, the corridor where fear once pressed and then let go. Mordecai's presence remained steady at the gate. Even robed in honor, he carried himself like a man who trusted ground more than garments. Those who passed felt lighter for having greeted him. He spoke little. His silence had learned to bless. The people prospered. Laughter returned to market stalls. Bread rose faithfully in ovens. Children practiced the songs they would sing when Adar returned, songs that began quietly and ended with smiles. And yet, Esther kept watch over the quiet. She listened for strain beneath the melody, for pride's footfall trying again to learn the steps of power. Peace, she knew, is not a possession, it is a stewardship. One afternoon, a group of travelers arrived from far provinces. Dust lined their hems, sun had darkened their brows. They brought gifts simple and full of meaning, woven cloth the color of river water, dates wrapped in cool leaves, a small lamp molded with the shape of a pomegranate. But the gift that mattered most was a story. They told of a village where fear had lived long after the decree was reversed, where memories remembered too well. A widow, young and weary, had kept her door closed. Then, on the feast day, children came to her threshold with bread still warm, with figs sweet as new mercy, with a letter that carried the king's seal and Mordecai's steady hand. They read aloud how sorrow had been turned to joy, how mourning had been turned to a day of kindness. And the widow opened her door. She opened her hands. Later, she opened her house to others. Now, the travelers said, eyes bright, the feast keeps her. Esther listened and let the words settle where gratitude keeps its store. Not every deliverance is loud. Some are simply doors learning to open again. In the cool of evening, she returned to the terrace that looked toward the city. The roofs of Susa held the sun's last gold like bowls catching light. The river drew a slow bright line through the streets. Beyond it, fields turned their faces to rest. Her heart grew quiet in the largeness of it all. She thought of the thread that had carried her, that thin, strong line that began in orphan childhood and ran, unbroken, through palace tests and midnight prayers. She could not have woven it. She could only hold it. Providence had done the weaving. Obedience had been the hand. That thread bound more than her life. It stitched her people to a promise older than exile, older than empire, older than fear itself. No decree could cut it. No gallows could reach it. It ran from Abraham's tents to palace stone, from desert nights to the lamps of Esther's chamber, and still it would run, through years yet unopened. She breathed, slowly. And let the certainty rest. What God begins, He continues. What He promises, He keeps. And what He keeps, He teaches His children to remember. At times, visitors asked to see the place where Esther had stood before the king. They expected grandeur to be the lesson, the height of columns, the gleam of gold. But when they stood there, many grew quiet instead. The space seemed to hold a different light, as if the room itself still kept the echo of a whisper that had changed history. Later, they spoke softly in courtyards, saying, "It was not the marble we felt. It was the mercy." Esther never sought those moments, never arranged them. Her task was the simple fidelity of each day, to greet the morning with gratitude, to receive petitions with patience, to let the poor feel seen, to let the anxious go out with lighter steps. This is how courage remains after the trumpet sleeps, by choosing the small obediences that keep doors open for peace. One night, a storm gathered quietly over the plain. Clouds shouldered one another without hurry. The first rain tapped the palace roof as if asking permission to tell its tale. Servants moved lamps in from the wind. Gardens leaned into the blessing. Esther stood beneath the eave and watched. She remembered another weather, not rain, but a swirl of fear and decision, and the way God had stood within it like a mountain. Lightning stitched white lines across the sky. Thunder rolled, not violent now, only vast. And she felt affection for the sound, as if some old teacher had returned for a visit, reminding, not warning. Mordecai joined her. They listened together without haste. "Storms return," he murmured at last, "but the rock does not move." She nodded. In the center of the rain, she felt the refrain her days had learned to sing, "Remain." When the shower passed, earth smelled new, and the night released a deeper dark, the friendly kind, thick with rest. Lanterns bobbed along the lanes as families walked home laughing, their shoulders dotted with rain that shone like small crowns. Another season turned. Letters were answered, fields were harvested, disputes were settled with hands clasped instead of fists. A child born on the anniversary of deliverance was carried into the palace courtyard, and Esther bent to touch the warm, wrinkled brow. The mother's eyes filled as she whispered, "We named her Joy." Esther smiled. Joy, not the noise of it, but the endurance of it, had become the empire's quiet wealth. She kept the little lamp the travelers had given, the pomegranate lamp. On evenings of remembrance, she lit it and watched the flame make a soft fruit of light. Seeds upon seeds, each a story, each a mercy, each an answered prayer. She thought of generations not yet awake to their days, and asked that the flame they inherit would be guarded by simple faith, not spectacle. Sometimes, she returned to the scrolls. The words did not grow old. They sounded like water when the body has traveled long, The Lord is compassionate and gracious. He remembers his covenant forever. Those who trust in him shall not be put to shame. Reading, she felt the same ease by which night gives way to morning, not by effort, but by promise. She closed the scroll and rested her hands on the table. In the quiet that followed, she sensed what had carried her from the first. God's nearness is not louder in crisis, it is simply noticed there. In peace, it remains the same, steady, patient, present as breath. To live wisely is to notice always. Let this noticing settle over you now. Consider the thin, unbreakable thread that runs through your own days, through rooms where you have wept, through windows where you have hoped, through doors you have not yet opened. You do not weave it. You hold it. And the hand that drew it through Esther's life draws it through yours with the same gentleness, the same strength. Rest with that assurance tonight. If storms gather, they will pass. If fears speak, they will quiet. The thread remains, and the rock beneath it all does not move. Breathe. Let remembrance become your pillow, and providence your blanket. You are kept by the one who keeps stories true. The years moved gently now. The palace, once filled with the constant hum of duty and decree, had quieted into the rhythm of peace. No new edicts thundered across the provinces. No messengers galloped through the night with scrolls of alarm. Only the measured pace of ordinary life, the kind of peace that grows not from power, but from trust. Esther's reign had become like a calm river, still on the surface, yet deep with unseen strength beneath. The people no longer spoke of fear when they spoke of the crown. They spoke of wisdom, of compassion, of a queen who remembered her people and her God. Each dawn began the same way, with the whisper of sandals on marble, the light of morning stretching long across the courtyards, and the sound of Esther's prayer. She would kneel near the same window where her courage had once taken shape, where her trembling had turned into trust. She no longer asked for signs or miracles. Her words were simple now. Keep me steady, Lord. Keep them safe. Keep this peace. Those three petitions had become the pulse of her heart. Mordecai, though older now, still stood each morning by the king's gate. His beard had turned the color of moonlight, his hands slower, but sure. He had become a living symbol of faith that endures. The quiet man who had once refused to bow before pride, now bowed only before the Almighty. The people greeted him with reverence that felt like affection. Children would run ahead to tell their parents when he appeared, and elders rose from their seats when he passed. But Mordecai wore their honor lightly. When asked what had made him so steadfast, he would smile and say, "I only stayed where I was placed, and God did the standing." His humility taught more than decrees ever could. On the day marking the feast of Purim, Esther and Mordecai sat together beneath a fig tree in the palace gardens. The branches arched over them like a green crown, and sunlight filtered through in patterns of gold and shade. They watched as servants carried baskets through the gates, filled with bread and dried fruits, gifts to the poor. Laughter drifted from the city beyond the walls, a music both old and new. Esther spoke softly, her voice blending with the murmur of the fountain beside them. "Do you remember," she said, "how quiet the palace was the night before I went to the king? It felt as though even the air was waiting to see what God would do." Mordecai smiled, eyes distant. "I remember the stillness," he said. "But I also remember the peace that came after. The kind that tells you heaven has already spoken, and all you need to do is walk where it leads." They sat without words for a while, the silence between them filled with memory, not of fear anymore, but of faith fulfilled. The tree above them dropped a single ripe fig onto the grass. Mordecai picked it up, turning it in his palm. He broke it open and handed half to Esther. The sweetness, when it touched her tongue, tasted of harvest after hunger, of God's timing, perfect and patient. That night, the city glowed with celebration. From every home came the scent of spice and bread, the hum of voices retelling the story of deliverance. Children wore wreaths of olive leaves, fathers lifted cups and said blessings of remembrance. The story of Esther and Mordecai was told again and again, and with each retelling, it became less about them, and more about the God who had written his mercy into their days. Esther listened from her balcony. The sound rose like incense, curling through the night air. The lamps below flickered in thousands of windows, each one a small testimony, proof that what had been meant for destruction had become the light of celebration. She whispered a prayer that had no request, only thanksgiving. "Thank you, Lord, for letting my life be a page in your book of faithfulness." The stars shimmered in answer, not loudly, but in the same rhythm of quiet that had always marked her walk with God. Time continued its patient circle. Mordecai grew frailer, his steps slower, but his peace never left him. On days when his strength faltered, he would sit at the gate rather than stand, and the people would come to him there, bringing their questions, their disputes, their gratitude. He would listen, speak softly, and always end the same way: "Remember what he has done." That is how peace is kept. When word came that he had passed into rest one quiet evening, the city mourned, not with despair, but with reverence. They said the same phrase again and again: "He kept watch until the end." Esther wept, not as one lost in grief, but as one grateful for a faithful friend who had finished his purpose well. In the garden, she planted a small olive tree beside the fig. "Let this one stand for him," she said softly. And as the leaves rustled, it felt as though the garden agreed. The years that followed were gentle ones. Esther ruled with patience and grace. Her hair silvered, her pace slowed, but her eyes, those calm, knowing eyes, never dimmed. The courtiers said her presence still carried peace the way dawn carries light, not forced, just faithful. And when she looked out from her window each morning, she still whispered her same three prayers: "Keep me steady, Lord. Keep them safe. Keep this peace." It was not the repetition of habit, it was devotion in rhythm, a melody between heaven and earth that had become her lifelong hymn. Let her song linger in your heart tonight. There is peace that comes from answered prayer, and there is peace that comes from simply knowing who listens. The latter lasts. It carries through age, through loss, through change, quiet, constant, unbroken. Like Esther, may you learn the beauty of that steady peace, not loud, not fleeting, but deep as roots beneath still waters. Breathe. And remember, God keeps watch until the end. And every faithful heart that says yes becomes part of the keeping. Evening came like a hand laying a cool cloth on a warm brow. The city dimmed to amber and then to blue, and the palace learned again its gentle hush. From the balcony, Esther watched lamps wake one by one across Susa, tiny suns consenting to be small, yet faithful. The sight felt familiar, like a psalm returning to its refrain. She rested both palms on the stone rail and let memory rise, not as a flood, but as a tide that knew its shore. There had been the first tremble in the corridor, the first breath at the threshold, the first touch of gold to hand, moments when fear had discovered it could not argue with obedience. There had been the garden where the king had walked in anger and returned with justice, the decree that answered a decree, the laughter that returned to doors that had forgotten how to open. Now the lesson gathered itself into one line that would not leave her: God keeps. He keeps promises. He keeps watch. He keeps peace. He keeps his people. The words repeated until repetition became reassurance, like the sea teaching the shore a rhythm it will not forget. From the garden below came the soft cadence of footsteps. Mordecai crossed the path, slower now, but steady, and paused beneath the fig and the small olive tree planted beside it. He traced the bark with weathered fingers as if reading a prayer written in wood. Esther watched him and felt the same quiet gratitude she felt whenever the wind remembered which way the river traveled. He lifted his face toward the balcony. No words, only a shared understanding. Faith had taught them a language that used silence like gold uses light. He remained a while and then returned to the gate, the place where his yes had first learned to stay. Esther closed her eyes and let the evening speak. A mother's song wandered up from a lower courtyard, not a performance, a promise. It wrapped its gentle thread through the branches, over the stone, into the chambers, and up to where she stood. It sounded like every vigil kept through hungry nights, every whisper offered when no answer seemed near, every amen that had learned to be as soft as breath. Under that melody, she remembered another song, the one her people had always carried: He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. She did not recite it aloud. She simply stood in it, the way a child stands in shade and knows she is kept without calculating the shape of the tree. Under the shadow, the phrase touched every scene of her past and gave it a single color: mercy. Under the shadow in the orphan years. Under the shadow in the choosing. Under the shadow in the fasting. Under the shadow at the scepter. Under the shadow in the writing of letters, the sending of riders, the lighting of lamps. Under the shadow now, when peace seemed ordinary and therefore most precious. She turned from the balcony and walked the corridor that led to a small inner room. Its walls held no display, only a low bench, a clay lamp, a folded shawl, a jar of oil. Here she had learned to listen. Here she had learned that waiting is not emptiness, it is hospitality for God. She knelt and let her hands fall open on her knees. No petition urgent enough to outrun gratitude, no speech eager enough to interrupt the hush. Courage had ceased to be a task, it had become a posture. Faith had ceased to be a moment, it had become a way of breathing. In that quiet she named, one by one, the keeps of God. You keep truth when lies grow loud. You keep timing when haste pretends to be wisdom. You keep doors when fear calls them walls. You keep hearts when the body shakes. You keep the little ones when the strong are tired. You keep watch when we sleep. Each sentence ended in stillness, and the stillness answered like a yes too tender to need sound. A breeze passed along the floor and lifted the edge of the shawl. She drew it around her shoulders, not against chill, but as a sign, a soft reminder that shelter can be worn as easily as it can be entered. She thought of her people spread like stars across the provinces, of the widow who had opened her door again, of the child named Joy, of tables that had learned to keep a place for the poor, of men who now measured strength in gentleness, of women who taught daughters to fast before speaking and pray before deciding. This, too, was a keeping, not only lives preserved, but customs purified, not only enemies silenced, but households schooled in kindness. Deliverance had put on daily clothes and sat at every table. Footsteps paused at the threshold. An attendant waited, then lightly set a small tray near the door, a cup of water, a piece of bread warm enough to be fragrant. No interruption. Only provision. Esther smiled, grateful that even service in this house had learned the rhythm of reverence. How many unseen obediences had held her on nights when visible courage seemed thin? She tore the bread, dipped it, tasted a sweetness that did not belong to wheat alone. Sustenance can be sacrament when the heart remembers who sends it. She rose and returned through the quiet halls. Torches were being lit, one, then another, and the corridor accepted their glow as the sky accepts stars. She paused at the great doors that opened toward the throne room and rested a hand upon their carved surface. The wood kept memory. It knew the weight of decision. It knew the calm of an afterward blessed by God. She did not enter. She only offered a small bow of thanks to the place where law had learned mercy and power had made room for grace. When she reached the balcony again, night had grown, and Susa had become a field of lamps. The city breathed peace the way a sleeper breathes, deep, regular, grateful. Esther lifted her face to the wide, attentive sky. She did not ask for tomorrow. She thanked God for the kind of today that teaches tomorrow how to arrive. "Keep," she whispered. "Keep, keep, keep." The word beat like a gentle drum. The heart's obedience turned to music. Below, the fig leaves stirred. Mordecai, finishing his watch, turned once more to look upon the palace. He rested his hand over his chest and bowed, not to stone, but to the God who had used stone and scepter and scroll to build a shelter for his people. Then he disappeared into the blue of evening, and the gate closed with a sound that resembled contentment. Esther lingered until the stars felt near enough to touch. When she finally stepped back into the room, she left the doors open so night could pray with her house. Sleep would come, and she would welcome it not as escape, but as trust. For under the shadow of the Almighty, rest is not a pause in work, it is the work's reward. Let this assurance rest upon you, too, as the hour grows quiet. You are kept. Your fears are named and noticed. Your steps are counted and guided. Your tomorrow is already in the hands that held Esther's today. Let the refrain gather in you until it is stronger than worry and softer than breath. God keeps, God keeps, God keeps. Breathe. Allow the shade of his wing to become the room where you sleep. Allow the rock beneath your life to carry your weight without your help. Allow peace to be not a visitor, but a resident. The garden had grown wide and wild with grace. Vines curled around white stone columns, Roses spilled over the paths in colors soft as candlelight, and the air always carried a perfume of calm. It was no longer the garden of planning or petition. It had become the garden of remembering. Esther walked there each morning, her pace unhurried, her steps in rhythm with the wind. Time had softened around her like silk drawn through gentle hands. She was older now, her hair silver like threads of dawn, but her face still bore that same peace, the kind that comes when a heart has made its home in faith. The fountains still sang, their voices low and even, and she sometimes thought they sounded like gratitude repeating itself. Every petal, every sound of water, every beam of light between the leaves was a reminder that God had turned her story into stillness. She sat by the fig tree that had stood since the days of deliverance, its trunk grown thick, its roots hidden deep. Beside it, the olive tree, planted for Mordecai, had spread its shade across the grass. Sometimes she would rest her palm upon its bark and whisper, "You are peace made visible." The tree never answered, but its leaves would move gently in reply, as if heaven agreed through branches. A young attendant often came to walk beside her. Her name was Hadara, gentle, with curious eyes. She had grown up hearing the story of the queen who saved her people, but seeing Esther in quiet years was not the same as hearing of Esther in glory. To Hadara, the queen was not distant, she was kindness wrapped in simplicity. One morning, as they moved through the garden, Hadara asked, "Your Majesty, were you ever afraid again after that day, when the king held out his scepter?" Esther smiled. "Fear visits everyone," she said softly. "It knocks at the same door it once found open. But faith knows now how to answer. When fear speaks, I let faith answer the door." Hadara nodded slowly, the lessons settling like sunlight across her shoulders. "And did you always know God would save you?" "No," Esther said, her voice quiet, "but I knew He would be with me, and that was enough." They walked in silence after that, the kind of silence that grows wisdom rather than ends conversation. When they reached the edge of the garden, Esther turned toward the younger woman and said, "Remember this, Hadara, deliverance is not a moment, it is a way of seeing. When you trust that God is working even in waiting, you begin to live inside His rescue every day." Later, when the attendants had gone, Esther remained alone beneath the trees. The light fell softer now, the color of the hour between gold and blue, the hour that teaches the world how to rest. She looked across the courtyard toward the palace. The halls that had once echoed with decisions now murmured with quiet duties. The great throne room, once the stage of miracles, was simply a hall of sunlight. How gentle God had been with her life, turning every sharp edge into a rounded truth. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of myrrh and rain. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly. Each breath felt like a psalm learned by heart. She thought of the faces that had come and gone, Mordecai, steadfast and unbending. The king, changed by compassion. The countless servants and soldiers who had learned mercy by watching deliverance unfold. She thought of her people scattered still across distant lands, each one a living echo of God's covenant. And she smiled, for she knew now that her story had never been hers alone. It belonged to the Keeper, the one who writes salvation into the soil and sky. Her part had only ever been to say yes. Evening arrived, its shadows long and soft as prayer. The olive leaves whispered in low harmony. Esther sat upon a bench of marble worn smooth by years of peace. A candle burned beside her, its flame swaying like the smallest heartbeat. She opened a small scroll, one of the psalms she loved most. The words glimmered in the dim light. "The Lord will preserve thy going out and thy coming in, from this time forth, and even forevermore." Her eyes lingered on forevermore. It did not sound like distance. It sounded like arrival. She closed the scroll, and the air felt holy with stillness. She whispered into that stillness, "Lord, you preserved me in the danger. Preserve me now in the peace." A quiet joy swelled through her, not the thrill of triumph, but the calm of completion. It felt as if all her breaths had gathered into one final prayer: "You have kept me. I am kept." When darkness deepened, Hadara came again, carrying a shawl for the cool. She found Esther still seated, her face peaceful, her eyes lifted toward the stars. "Your Majesty," the girl said softly, "will you come inside? The night air grows cold." Esther turned, her smile warm as the candles glow. "In a moment," she said, her tone like a lullaby. "I am just listening to the quiet. It sounds like his promise." And truly, it did. The whole garden seemed to hum with a presence unseen, the kind that does not visit, but abides. Hadara hesitated, then asked, "What does his promise sound like?" Esther's eyes shone with gentle certainty. "It sounds," she said, "like rest." "Oi." The girl nodded and withdrew. And Esther, left alone beneath the olive and fig, watched as the candle burned low. The flame bent once, twice, then straightened, steady, sure. A night bird called softly. The stars above Persia shone as they had in every season of her life, unchanged, eternal, bright. She whispered one last prayer: "Let peace be their inheritance, Lord, and let my heart remain with you." The wind stirred again, and the leaves answered like an amen. "Let this peace wash over you now." When the striving ends, when the story folds into rest, what remains is not loss, but love fulfilled. The same God who steadied Esther's trembling holds your quiet nights in his hands. You are not merely surviving, you are being kept. And even in stillness, your life is his garden, blooming softly under his wing. Breathe. Let the day exhale. Let your spirit rest. And know, you are, even now, under the shadow of his peace. Twilight lingered longer than usual, as if evening had decided to walk at Esther's pace. The city exhaled into blue. Rooftops gathered the day's last gold and held it like a blessing cupped in two hands. In the palace garden, fig and olive leaned toward one another, their leaves telling small stories to the wind. Fountains quieted to a gentler speech, and the paths remembered footsteps they loved. Esther sat on the marble bench beneath the trees. The shawl Hadara had laid across her shoulders held the day's warmth a little longer. Time, kind as a faithful servant, moved without hurry. Her face bore the ease of one who has learned the whole alphabet of trust and now spells only simple words: "Thank you, keep, peace." Hadara came softly, as those who love peace learn to do. She carried a small lamp in one hand and a folded parchment in the other. "Your Majesty," she began, and then paused, for the garden had a way of asking voices to kneel. "Letters have arrived from the western provinces. They send greetings for Purim, and news of a new well for a village that lacked water. They ask that a portion of the feast be sent to widows there, as is custom." Esther smiled, the lines at her eyes turning light. "Then let the baskets be full," she said, "and let the children deliver them." Hadara nodded, already seeing the small hands carrying large kindness. "And Hadara," Esther added after a breath, "write back that we remember them, not only in plenty, but in prayer." The young woman's eyes shone. It was the oldest lesson, and it never grew old. They walked together along the path where roses bent their heads in evening grace. "Tell me again," Hadara asked, "about the night before the scepter. How did you make your heart quiet enough to hear God?" Esther looked toward the first small star over Susa. "Quiet does not begin in a room," she said gently. "It begins in surrender. When the soul stops arguing with God, the world grows quiet enough to listen." They paused near the fountain. Water slipped from bowl to bowl, silver on stone, patient as mercy. "Could you teach me a prayer for nights like this?" Hadara whispered. Esther nodded. And the prayer came the way dew comes, without effort, exactly on time. "Lord of every hour, you kept us when fear learned our names. Keep us now when peace might make us forget. Teach our hands to open before they ask to hold. Teach our feet to wait before they learn to run. Teach our hearts to love the weight of your will until obedience feels like rest. Amen." They stood in the Amen for a long while. In the hush, even the fountain seemed to pause and bow. Later, Hadara brought a low table with bread, figs, and a small cup. Esther broke the loaf and placed a portion back into the basket. "For the night watch," she said. It was a habit now, to let the dark find kindness waiting. "Will you rest indoors?" Hadara asked. "Soon," Esther answered. "I love to watch the first lamps return to the windows. It is the city's way of saying, we are kept." One by one the lights awakened across Susa. Some bright, some modest, all faithful. From a lane below drifted the sound of a flute, and from a far courtyard, a mother's lullaby wove the air with comfort. The music did not demand attention. It escorted it toward peace. Esther's thoughts gathered like birds returning to roost. They perched upon branches she knew well, Mordecai's steady gait, the king's changed eyes, the letters that ran faster than fear, the feast that taught joy how to be generous. Every memory ended at the same tree, the tree of God's keeping. She lifted the cup and let the water touch her lips. It tasted like beginning and like completion at once. Hadara watched the queen's hands, how gently they moved, how nothing in them hurried, how even the setting down of a cup could become a benediction. When night had fully entered the garden, Hadara set the small lamp upon the window ledge of Esther's chamber. Its flame was humble, yet it taught every shadow how to behave. Esther stood beside it, looking out over the sleeping roofs. "Do you know why I love this little light?" she asked. Hadara shook her head with a smile. Because it tells the darkness the truth, Esther said. It does not conquer it, it confesses God within it. The young woman folded the parchment she had carried and placed it on the table for morning reply. Will you wake me if you need anything? Esther touched her cheek, mother and mentor in one gesture. If I need anything, I will ask the one who never sleeps, she answered softly. And if he asks for your help, I trust he will wake you. Hadara laughed, the sound light as a fig leaf's clap in wind. She bowed and withdrew, leaving door and night ajar for prayer. Alone, Esther sat by the window. The lamp sang its single note of flame. Beyond it, constellations wrote wisdom in bright, patient syllables. She did not try to read them. She let them read her, to find a heart no longer beating to the drum of urgency, but to the slow hymn of gratitude. She thought of Mordecai, how the olive leaves over his stone spoke when the wind passed through. Keeper, she breathed, keep me as you kept him, faithful at the gate, gentle in counsel, content to remain. A breeze moved the curtain, and the flame bowed, then stood upright again. Esther felt her breath do the same, bow and rise, yield and be kept. She laid both hands over her heart. No petition came, only a blessing shaped for others, for Hadara with her bright questions, for the children who would carry baskets longer than their arms, for widows whose windows would hold steady light, for a people learning that joy must be practiced like prayer. Let them be protected by the habit of kindness, she whispered. Let them find you not only in deliverance, but in dishes washed, in bread shared, in sleep unafraid. Oi! The hour grew deeper. Somewhere a watchman called and another answered, their voices measuring the night like beads on a string. Esther's eyes grew heavy, not with fatigue, but with consent. The garden sighed, the palace settled, the sky leaned close. She rose slowly and went once more to the fig and olive. Under their mingled shade, she pressed her palm to each trunk. Thank you for keeping my memories, she murmured. Then she traced the bench with her fingers, as if blessing the stone that had learned her prayers by weight. When she returned to the window, the lamp was a little lower, its glow round as a quiet moon. Esther lay upon her couch, the shawl warming her shoulders, her face turned toward the small, steadfast light. She did not count victories or rehearse dangers. She listened to the room's silence until it became a psalm, and to her own breathing until it matched the patience of God. Her last waking thought was not of palaces or decrees, but of a hand, large enough to hold an empire, gentle enough to steady a single heartbeat. Under that hand, she rested. Let this same benediction settle on you now. Let the lamp of trust glow in your window, telling the darkness the truth it cannot change. You do not need to conquer the night, you need only to confess the keeper within it. Breathe. Slowly. And let surrender invite the quiet that listens. The one who never sleeps keeps watch. Your name, like Esther's, is safe upon his lips. Rest. And rest again. Beneath the mercy that teaches even shadows how to be kind. Night deepened over Susa like a soft river. The stars hung low and tender, the air hushed as though creation itself were listening. Every courtyard flame burned small but steady, each one a witness to peace. The city slept without fear, its dreams gentle, its heart still held by the faith of one woman's yes. Inside the palace, a single lamp glowed from the queen's chamber, the same small light Hadara had placed there. Its flame flickered with the rhythm of breath, sometimes bowing, sometimes standing tall, as if it were breathing with her. Esther lay upon her couch, the shawl drawn close about her shoulders, her silver hair soft against the pillow. Her eyes were half open, not in wakefulness, but in wonder, as though watching a vision no one else could see. In that quiet, the world seemed to pause its spinning, the fountains ceased their speaking, and the olive leaves outside held their stillness. Even the wind forgot its language, for all creation was honoring a servant finishing her task. Hadara entered quietly to tend the lamp. She saw the queen resting, her face calm, her breathing light as the hush between psalms. The young woman knelt nearby and waited, not to serve, but to witness. She had learned that some moments are not for doing, they are for reverence. After a long silence, Esther spoke, a whisper thin as the line between earth and heaven. "Hadara," she said, "do you hear it?" The girl looked around. "The garden?" she asked softly. Esther's smile deepened. "No," she murmured. "Not the garden. The stillness. It sounds like home." Hadara took her hand, cool, light, the hand that had once touched a scepter and changed a kingdom. It now held nothing and lacked nothing. "Will you rest, my queen?" she asked. "I already am," Esther answered, and her gaze drifted beyond the ceiling, to where the unseen waits without impatience. Her lips moved once more. "If you are with me, Lord, I will not need to be strong." And with that, her breathing slowed, gentle waves drawing farther from the shore. Outside, the night deepened into perfection. A faint breeze moved through the garden, carrying the scent of myrrh and olive and the last bloom of jasmine. It circled through the open window, touched the flame of the lamp, and for an instant, the light bowed low, a reverent gesture, not of ending, but of acknowledgement. The flame rose again, its glow tender and unwavering. It burned not for vigilance, but for remembrance. Hadara wept softly, not with sorrow alone, but with the holy ache of gratitude. She felt the presence of peace filling the room, settling over the bed like a warm mantle. She whispered, "She is kept," and somehow she knew heaven had heard. When morning crept gently across the sky, the first light entered the chamber and met the last glow of the lamp. The two lights touched, and for one breathless instant, there was no difference between them, only brightness. Outside, the city stirred, the sound of life returning to its daily grace. No trumpet announced what had passed. The world simply continued, carrying the peace she had planted into another dawn. Mordecai's olive tree swayed, its branches whispering over the fig. A pair of doves lifted from its shade, their wings bright in the rising sun. Hadara stood by the window, watching the sky gather its colors. Her heart was heavy and light all at once. She knew this was how God writes farewells, not with thunder, but with gentle brightness that never fades. She bowed her head and prayed the prayer Esther had taught her. "Lord of every hour, you kept her when fear knew her name. Keep us now when peace might make us forget. Teach our hands to open before they ask to hold. Teach our feet to wait before they learn to run. Teach our hearts to love your will until obedience feels like rest. As she prayed, the garden seemed to echo her words, a rustle of leaves, a ripple of fountain, a single ray of light touching the olive trunk like a seal. By midday, the word had spread through Susa. The people came in silence, not with wailing, but with gratitude too deep for noise. They filled the courtyards, each carrying something small, a loaf of bread, a handful of flowers, a candle to place beneath the fig and olive. No one commanded the gathering. It was as if the city itself knew what to do, how to honor a life that had turned obedience into peace. They did not call her queen that day. They called her by her truest name, Hadassah. The name of beginnings, the name of roots before crowns, the name God had known first. And as they prayed, the wind moved again through the trees, a soft music of remembrance. It sounded like 1,000 whispered thank yous woven into a single word, kept. When evening came again, Hadara lit the lamp at the same window. Its flame flickered to life, steady as before. She whispered, "This light will never go out, my queen." Then she corrected herself, "No, not my queen. God's servant." And beyond the walls, where stars began to wake, one shone brighter than the rest, as if a crown had been lifted from earth and found its rightful place in heaven. Let this stillness be your rest tonight. For every story of faith ends not with final words, but with a quiet carried into eternity. The same peace that closed Esther's eyes keeps yours. The same mercy that called her home walks the corridors of your life, lighting lamps, whispering, "You are kept." Breathe. Let the night draw close like a friend. Let gratitude be your final thought before sleep. You are safe under His shadow. You are remembered in His light. And like Esther, you are held by a hand that never lets go. Morning moved through Susa like a hand smoothing linen. The streets woke without hurry. Doors opened with the soft courtesy of hinges well kept. No trumpet sounded, yet every face bore the same awareness. Something holy had happened in the night, and day must step gently to receive it. By the fig and the olive, the air held a fragrance of bread and oil and flowers set down by grateful hands. It was not a monument raised by rulers, but a memory tended by love. Hadara stood there, shawl pressed close, watching the first rays slip leaf to leaf. She did not cry now. Tears had already completed their good work and yielded room for gratitude. In her hands she held a small lamp, the same pattern as the one in Esther's window, a pomegranate shaped to cradle flame. She touched it to a taper, and the fire answered as if recognizing its own lineage. "Keep her," she prayed, voice low. "Teach me to carry what she carried." The prayer did not rise like a shout, it settled like dew. Around her, the city learned the same prayer in its own dialect. Merchants with measured voices, mothers with softened hands, children whispering the name Hadassah as though tasting a sweetness they did not want to swallow too quickly. At the gate, Mordecai's place remained, a bench kept clear, a stone smoothed by faithful waiting. Men paused there with uncovered heads. Women, passing with jars balanced like small moons, slowed to touch the wall and leave a blessing only God could hear. No law commanded these gestures. Peace had learned to write its own customs. When the officials of the court approached Hadara and asked how the city might honor the queen, she answered without rehearsal, by keeping what she kept. They looked puzzled. She smiled and added, kindness to the poor, open doors at feast, quiet courage when fear knocks, and prayer before every decision. It sounded too simple to be royal. It sounded exactly like Esther. So the word spread in official lines and ordinary ones. Let there be baskets set aside each week for widows. Let young scribes learn to begin scrolls with prayer. Let the gate keep a jug of cool water for travelers, and a seat for the weary. Let Hadar remain a joy that visits hungry homes first. In this way, remembrance learned hands and feet. Before the next moon was full, letters arrived from the provinces, condolences braided with gratitude. They told of lamps lit in far villages, of songs sung low so the youngest could learn the shape of trust, of wells named in her honor not to glorify stone but to bless thirst. Hadara read them aloud in the garden as she tended the olive and the fig. Some lines made her laugh, others made her eyes grow bright. All sounded like the same river, fed by many springs, moving toward the wide sea of God's keeping. She answered each letter in the manner Esther taught, brief, true, warm. We remember with you. We rejoice that peace has learned your road. Give generously. Be gentle. Pray first. Wax sealed the words. Riders carried them away like small parcels of daylight. On the evening of the 7th day, Hadara climbed the stair to Esther's chamber. The small lamp still waited by the window. She lit it, trimmed it, and then opened the shutters so night and flame could greet each other like friends. Susa glowed, not bright, not dim, but steady. From somewhere in the lanes came a boy's laughter. From a nearby courtyard, an old man's psalm rose with the patience of long-remembered lines. Hadara sat where Esther had Saturday. The cushion held the ghost of a peace that was not gone, only given. She folded her hands and let the silence begin to shape her, the same way water shapes stone by returning, returning, returning. Lord of every hour, she breathed, keep me small enough to be faithful and brave enough to be kind. The words felt like a key fitting a lock. The room opened, not in size, but in knowing. She looked toward the bed and saw the shawl folded with tender precision. She rose, took it up, and held it for a breath. It smelled of olive and fig and the faintest trace of myrrh, the fragrance of prayers answered. Hadara laid it across her own shoulders. The weight was not heavy. It was instruction. Days found a new cadence, braided from old mercies. Hadara walked the garden paths each morning as Esther had done, reading the Psalms aloud not for display but for the way the words taught air to be holy. She learned the names of servants and the names of stray cats and the names of widows whose doors faced the western wind. When disputes came to the courtyard, she remembered to ask for water first, to rinse hot words before they stained a day. People began to say, "She moves like the Queen moved," as if peace were a person walking beside her. In council, she repeated the wisdom she had been given. Begin with prayer. Choose the poor. Do not flatter speed. Let mercy amend what pride wrote in haste. Some laughed at the gentleness of her rules, until they worked. There is a sternness inside true kindness that no noise can match. As Hadar drew near again, preparations took on their familiar hush of joy. Children practiced the story, each eager to speak the part where the scepter leaned. Bakers set aside flour for homes whose barrels were thin. Neighbors swapped spices and songs. And in the palace, Hadara oversaw the weaving of simple ribbons, threads of blue and white to tie around baskets so the receiver would know the gift had been prayed over as well as prepared. The night before the feast, she returned to the trees. Moonlight rested on the fig like a blessing. The olive leaves made a small music in the breeze. Hadara knelt, not as queen, not as servant, but as the next link in a chain mercy had been lengthening since Abraham counted stars. Hadassah, she whispered, using the name that tasted like roots, teach me how to keep. Teach me how to listen. Teach me how to say yes. A dove shifted in the branches, and the sound felt like answer. When the feast arrived, Susa did what it had learned. Doors widened, tables stretched, laughter wore humility like a garland. Hadara sent children in pairs to the poorest lanes, each with a basket too big and a smile just big enough. At noon she stood at the gate with the jug of water and poured for strangers until her shadow crossed from one side of the courtyard to the other. In the evening she walked among the houses and saw lamps in every window, soft little suns confessing the keeper in the dark. Near the fig and olive, she placed the pomegranate lamp and lit it with a steady hand. People gathered, not to mourn, but to remember rightly. An elder spoke the story with pauses for gratitude. A widow placed a wreath at Mordecai's tree. A child recited the line he had practiced, "Thus shall it be done to the man the king delights to honor," and everyone smiled at the justice housed in those simple words. Hadara lifted her face to the night and felt the same quiet Esther had loved, that vast, kind stillness that speaks without sound. She whispered the small benediction Esther gave her, "Let rest be their inheritance." And as she spoke, she knew it was already true. Let this inheritance lean over you now. Not wealth that rusts, not pride that cracks, but peace that remembers who keeps it. Let your hands learn the habit of kindness. Let your feet learn the patience of waiting. Let your breath find the pace of prayer. You need not wear a crown to continue Esther's story, only a willing heart, quiet enough to say yes when God invites. Breathe. Let the lamps of trust glow in your windows. Let the feast of gratitude find a place at your table, and let the keeper's nearness become the law of your night. Dawn returned as if the world were remembering a promise. Light spilled over Susa's rooftops, soft and golden, touching clay, metal, and skin with the same gentleness. It moved through alleys where children still slept beside the remnants of feast baskets, through courtyards where oil lamps faded into smoke, through palace corridors where quiet had learned to dwell. The air smelled of bread and myrrh, of life continuing. Somewhere, a rooster called. Somewhere else, laughter echoed before words awoke. And beyond the palace gate, the fig and the olive drank the early sun, their leaves whispering the same refrain they had learned from Esther's prayers. Keep. 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 Hadara stood between them, watching the light gather on her palms. The feast had ended, yet peace had not departed. She felt no ache of loss, only the warmth of inheritance. Everything that mattered had remained: faith, kindness, memory, and the steady certainty that God does not leave what He begins. She knelt, touched the soil, and whispered, "Morning always returns. Even when night feels endless, the sun keeps its promise." Then she rose, straightened her shawl, and turned toward the palace. It was time to continue the rhythm Esther had taught, to pray, to serve, to trust. The work of faith was never done, it was only handed on. Inside, she passed the chamber where the queen had once slept. The lamp still stood in the window, its wick trimmed, its glass clear. Hadara reached to light it, but the first beam of dawn slipped through the shutters and met the unlit wick. For a heartbeat, it flared without flame, a brightness too gentle to name. She smiled, recognizing it as the same light that had carried Esther home. She left the lamp unlit. The day itself was burning with remembrance. By mid-morning, the palace was alive with quiet industry. Servants carried food to the poor. Scribes copied psalms onto small scraps for children to memorize. The air, even busy, held the calm of purpose. The city had learned to breathe in harmony, its work as worship, its rest as praise. Hadara joined the council of elders in the courtyard. They spoke of trade, of justice, of fields. When disputes rose, she answered softly, "Let us remember mercy before decision." It was the kind of sentence that changed the shape of days. She did not speak with authority earned, but with peace inherited. An old man from the provinces approached her later and said, "We thought the Queen's story had ended. But perhaps it is still being written." Hadara nodded. Every time we choose kindness over haste, every time we trust God in waiting, another line is added to her story, and to ours. In the evening, as the sky folded into amber and indigo, Hadara returned to the garden. Children were playing near the fountains, their laughter carrying through the air like small bells. One little girl ran to her and held up a handful of olive leaves. "For Hadassa," she said solemnly. Hadara knelt and smiled. "And do you know why we honor her?" The child nodded with grave certainty. "Because she was brave and because she listened." "Listening," Hadara whispered, "is the beginning of courage." The child pressed the leaves into her hand and ran back to her friends. Hadara placed them at the foot of the olive tree, and for a moment she imagined she could hear two voices in the wind, Esther's and Mordecai's, blending with the rustle of branches, saying what they had always said, "Trust the keeper." That night, the city once again grew still. The moon rose over the plain, the same moon that had watched over fasting, over feasting, over faithful waiting. Hadara lit the lamp by the window, not out of mourning now, but as a gesture of continuation, a spark to remind the darkness who it belongs to. From the window, she could see every other lamp across Susa, hundreds of them, glowing softly in windows and courtyards, each one repeating the same word in unspoken chorus, "Kept." She whispered into the night, "Peace upon this city, peace upon the generations, peace upon the story that never ends." The lamp flame steadied, and a breeze passed through the curtains, not to extinguish, but to bless. And beyond time, where stories rest in their completion, Esther's spirit stood in light, no longer crown or title, only beloved. She looked upon the world she had served and saw that it was well, saw the peace flowing from heart to heart like water in desert places. She whispered into eternity, "Thank you, Lord, for letting my obedience become their peace." Heaven answered not with thunder, but with stillness, the same stillness she had loved on earth. For God's reward is not applause, but the unending presence of His own peace. And so her story does not close. It opens. Each dawn that finds you breathing, each prayer whispered into the dark, each act of kindness no one sees. These are the new chapters of her legacy. These are the living pages of faith that cannot die. Let your soul rest in that truth tonight. You, too, are written into the same keeping. Your courage, your surrender, your smallest prayer, they are threads in the same tapestry God has been weaving since the first morning. And when night falls, He does not stop. He simply works in quieter light. So breathe. Let the day end in gratitude. Let your heart unclench. Let rest become your worship. For the keeper who called Esther home calls you, too, into his eternal morning. And when you sleep tonight, you do not drift into darkness, you drift into his light.